In this lesson, we're going to look at vertical and horizontal axes, why they're important for us, how to use them in gesture drawing, as well as how we're going to use them in our normal drawing when we're busy drawing characters out of our imaginations. So the first thing is we want to know what these are, right? What is a vertical axis? What is a horizontal axis? And I've got these three example images here to illustrate this point. The first thing we're going to look at is the horizontal axis of this girl on the left. We're going to use her eye line to define the kind of tilt, if you will, the vertical or horizontal tilt, in this case horizontal tilt of her head. And we can use her shoulder line to determine the horizontal tilt of her shoulders and her chest area. And then we can estimate where her pelvic line is to assume the horizontal tilt of her pelvis. And then for the knees, for the legs, we can then use the knees, which is something like that. So we basically just link the knees together. And when you look at these lines and you recognize that they are not parallel, that is a very good thing. We want to avoid parallels in our horizontal and vertical tilts, right? Let's look at the next image. Image's horizontal tilts. There's a line through her eyes and her shoulder line and her pelvic line. Once again, no parallels. Everything is at some kind of angle. And in the last image, her eye line, her shoulder line. We'll have to assume her pelvis is something like that, and her knee line. And once again, no parallels. And this is very, very key in character drawing to achieving dynamic looking character posing, right? Or dynamic character poses. For gesture drawing, particularly, the horizontal tilts are useful for helping us quickly grasp the pose of the reference material we're looking at. So that's the primary reason we're learning this now, but we will touch on this again when we get to character composition. Nevertheless, let's look at the vertical tilts in these forms. Here we can see her head tilting slightly forward and her torso sort of tilting at that angle, her pelvis tilting down, and then her legs each individually tilting at different angles. We don't really need to do the arms that much. Similarly here, her head tilts at this angle vertically. Her chest is kind of tilting at the same angle. So if this were a drawing, we might want to modify that a little bit, tilt the head forward vertically or back vertically a little bit, just so that there isn't a parallel. And then her pelvis tilting at a different angle, which is great, right? We don't want those parallels. This sample image here for her head. Her chest is tilting this way, her pelvis is likely tilting at that angle, and then her legs are tilting both at different angles. And so this once again goes back to our rule as well, our rule in our thinking about parallels and how parallels are something we want to avoid. Even in the tilts, we want to avoid parallels. But the great thing is when you're talking about horizontal vertical tilts or horizontal and vertical axes, this really helps us get dynamism in our posing. All right, so let's close these examples down. Let's take a quick look at what an image looks like when we add it in and when we leave it out. So I'm going to do just a very quick form drawing here. We're going to just add in some elements. And I'm just doing very shorthand forms here to get this in. I say shorthand because I'm not drawing all the way through. I'm more imagining the drawing through in my mind of the actual shape of these forms. Let's change that one a little bit. Let's do this instead. Keep it rough, keep it loose. All right, not exactly proportionate, but it'll serve our purposes for this demo. All right, so here we have a drawing that is pretty much tiltless. It's tiltless in all of its vertical and horizontal major regions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the selection tool, the digital selection tool in Photoshop, to manually tilt these and introduce some dynamism into the pose. So I'm tilting the head forward there. I'm going to select the shoulders and the arms as one body here. Tilt the shoulders this way. All right. And I think we'll leave the legs on their own different positionings. And we'll just tilt the pelvis down like that. And just for the sake of being correct, we want to now adjust the position of the legs just a little bit based on the new angle of the pelvis, right? So we'll grab this one and we will adjust that. I think in this instance we want to put it just a little bit higher. All right. And now what we have is a character that is significantly more dynamic than the first one, because the first one has these very parallel horizontal axes and also very parallel vertical axes. Like everything's very, very parallel and boring. And, you know, somewhere in the viewer's subconscious, they're recognizing this and it's not exciting them. There's no asymmetry to it. It's very predictable. Yet in this one, we have very nice opposing horizontal and verticals. And so we've easily achieved a level of dynamism. I suppose these two are actually very similar, the legs, but still a bit different. I guess these are a little bit different now that I look at it. But nevertheless, we've now achieved significant levels of dynamism just by adjusting the horizontal and vertical tilts, or horizontal and vertical axes, whichever you prefer. I prefer tilts personally. Right, and this gives us dynamism. Now, for the purposes of gesture drawing, when we are assessing and looking at the reference material, when we get into it, and there will be demos of this coming up, we will have a reference image on the left, and we'll be wanting to capture that gesture on the right. And looking at the reference material's horizontal tilts particularly, and adding in those horizontal lines while we're trying to grasp the gesture, helps us quickly get the proportions and quickly find out the right locations for elements as we're drawing them out. And you'll see that's great. But for the purposes of drawing in general, we will revisit this topic and explain how it's absolutely critical to have your horizontal and your vertical tilts happening in the forms to bring dynamism to the pose and a natural look, and have the characters seem like they're actually trying to balance themselves and as if they were alive and you were capturing them in a moment of time. As a last note on this lesson, the Italian word for this sort of act of balancing in a way is called contrapposto, which means counterpose. And effectively it's describing when we rest our weight on one side of our bodies. Get a layer going here. Take this character over here, for example. Because he's leaning back over here, he's resting his weight on his right leg, which pushes his pelvis up. All right. And his torso is now coming slightly down, which causes the skin area here on this side to kind of stretch because the pelvis is tilting down here and the torso is tilting up. And so what you have is the start of something that we will go into later as well, called squash and stretch, in a sense, where this section, and let's get a different color here, is squashing, and this section here is stretching out. Now, squash and stretch is used in many different instances, but in this instance, this is what's happening, where when this pivot point is moved, one side of the body stretches and the other side of the body squashes, and it's a very interesting thing to note. However, we don't need to learn contrapposto necessarily in that way, although it is good to understand how the body is balancing itself and where the weight is going. But what's better for us is to simply remember, when we're drawing our characters, let us make sure we are having this variance and making sure that we do not have parallels in our horizontal or our vertical axes. We really want to avoid parallels in art in general, unless we're doing something that is more blueprinty, obviously. All right. That's the end of this lesson. Let's move on.